VikesNow, I am Dustin Baker. We're talking about the 6-5 Vikings. The Vikings fell on the road by a single point at the Denver Broncos. And I, in a preliminary sense last night, thought I would use this show to talk about Josh Dobbs and where we go from here with expectations on him. But based on reaction from fans, we've changed the topic because I have to address and hopefully explain why these overreactions from Vikings faithful are a little bit out of left field. I guess I wouldn't say non-predictable, but we really need some perspective on losing at Denver. So let's get into several things as to why it's really not that criminal of an act of the Vikings loss at Denver. And the first one is the Vikings were underdogs for a reason. I mean, Vegas assigned a 2.5, 3-point spread in favor of Denver. And while that was a little head-scratching because the Vikings had a 6-4 record to the Broncos 4-5, Las Vegas wants to get your money, and so they're not going to concoct a point spread just for shits and giggles. They believed that basically the Vikings and Broncos were on par, and because the game was in Denver, they gave them the home team nudge by 2.5 or 3 points. So we're complaining about a loss, not me, but some of yous out there, maybe not all of yous, about a loss to a Broncos team when you were the underdog going into it. Vikings were supposed to lose by 2 or 3, and they lost by 1. So it's not supernatural if you take a step back and realize, you might think the Vikings are awesome and on the cusp of being exactly like the 2017 team. Maybe they will. But Vegas does not, and they prove that with the point spread. So if this was the opposite, where the Vikings were favored by 5 or 6, and then they had a turd and lost by 1, yeah, we could overreact, but that wasn't the case. According to odds makers, the Vikings weren't going to win this game in the first place, and then they almost did, but they didn't. So I also want to get out there that now that we've seen basically 3 games of Josh Dobbs, last night was the most underwhelming game. It was kind of like his Cardinals tenure, where he fumbled. What did he have? A fumble, interception, and then Madison had the other fumble. One of the fumbles from Dobbs was a little iffy because it was from Kareem Jackson's latest chapter of a legal hit, so perhaps that shouldn't have been a fumble. Well, it shouldn't have been. That should have been called at 15 yards, but that's the way it goes. But I want to let you guys and gals know that this is the Josh Dobbs experience. I still think that with the correct coach, whether that's Kevin O'Connell or somebody like Kyle Shanahan, that he is an entry-level QB1 that can probably guide a team like these Vikings or those 49ers to a 10-7, 11-6 record, which is really good, especially for him. You didn't think he was much of anything not too long ago. But the curious fumbles or the silly throws and, the pocket thing where he turns around and looks the other way but spins back and then runs out of the way and thinks that that's good. This is part of it. I believe that now, he's the Vikings quarterback for 3 games. He's not going to be a pocket passer or progress through his reads like Kirk Cousins did. Cousins was actually wonderful at that. So in terms of these bad games from the Vikings or these meh games from Dobbs, this is what we signed up for. This is what's going to happen. And there's a reason that he is wasn't a first rounder or 7 teams have said sayonara. He's pretty good, but he has a lot of strange tendencies, mainly the fumbles, and then a couple, hero ball interceptions. Or that one was really Ty Chandler's gaffe. But I think on the whole, now we've seen 3 games, this is Dobbs. There's going to be some fumbles, there's going to be some picks, and hopefully you employ a gangbusters defense like the Vikings to an extent have fired up in the past 6 or 7 games that some of this stuff can offset. So welcome to the Dobbs experience. There shall be fumbles, there shall be some interceptions, there'll be some really heroic runs, some sweet touchdown passes to Josh Oliver. It's all part of the dance. It's not going to be flawless football. Another thing on contextually on losing to the Broncos, I say this only so you can understand what we're up against here. The Vikings were without Kirk Cousins, Justin Jefferson, Marcus Davenport, Jordan Hicks, Caleb Evans, and Cam Akers. I always, if I put that out in the atmosphere, that's a lot of red meat from your roster not to have. People will be like, oh, every team has injuries. Yeah, they do. But are they really Every team's without Justin Jefferson, the offensive player of the year, and then that team is also without QB1 Kirk Cousins, who was like a top 12 performer this year. No. If your response to, well, the Vikings are losing all these guys, so is everybody else, that's bullshit. I understand injuries are a part of the game, but when you're without Cousins and Jefferson, then by the way, Davenport or Hicks, who's having a Pro Bowl season, or Caleb Evans, that's a lot of guys to miss and just hope for next man up across the board. So here's the problem. You go into a road game with a team that's suddenly hot in the Broncos for some reason, and you have mistakes to the tune of losing by 1 point, or an upside-down turnover differential. You need those horses, like Justin Jefferson on that final drive especially, or Kirk Cousins, or Marcus Davenport. Those are the guys who make up the slack so that you can overcome that 1 point loss and get you maybe into the territory of a 3-point win. I was starved for Jefferson down the stretch of that game because no wide receivers were really getting in the mix. It was the Hawkinson program, and Dobbs distributed the ball, fairly equitably, but when you needed it the most, a game-winning drive, it would have been wonderful to have a target in Justin Jefferson. And if Patrick Surtain was going to lock him down for that drive, great. Then you have Jordan Addison wreaking havoc on the other side. But there were a lot of injuries, and I don't think the Vikings could keep getting away with this win streak against all odds with Josh Dobbs, no Jefferson. I think we convinced ourselves that they're just going to win every game from here on out. And that was never going to happen. So it makes all the sense in the world that they would lose to a hot team on the road in a spot where the Vikings haven't won since 1999. And interestingly, positively, the playoff probability for the Vikings didn't even really move because the Tampa Bay Buccaneers lost to the 49ers. When we entered that game, the playoff probability for the Vikings was about 80%. Then the Buccaneers lost before, and then the Vikings lost Sunday night, and it dropped to like 78% to reach the postseason. So if your end game is this Cousins-less Vikings, this Josh Dobbs aeronautical ride, if your goal is to get into the postseason, which I think most of us, that's the objective, the playoff probability barely moved because of some other stuff around the league like the Buccaneers. I guess the odds of winning the NFC North took a hit because now you're 2.5 games behind the Lions. But, what do we say every show? If the Lions are going to drop a game, great. The Vikings just need to get within 2 games before Christmas Eve, and then the Vikings control their own fate. And so I have to ask, you could put it in the comments or tweet at me, did you really think that the Josh Dobbs-led Jefferson-less Vikings were just going to win every game for the rest of the year? I didn't. That's why I picked the Broncos to win this week. It was like a tailor-made, a letdown game. I thought they'd lose by 3. They lost by 1. But I think if you're going to, just check Twitter, check the X app. And folks last night, even this morning, are really disgruntled, calling this loss devastating and stuff like that. I'm like, bitch, have you watched Vikings football for longer than a week? This isn't devastating. This didn't even scratch the surface of devastating. It was a road loss and an AFC West opponent, which happens to the Vikings, unfortunately. I think on a broader point, did you expect the Vikings to just win every game without Jefferson plus Dobbs? I think the Super Bowl aspirations for this team were cooked the moment Cousins got hurt in Green Bay. Now, they probably weren't even going to win the Super Bowl with Cousins, but I think anytime you lose your QB1, especially a handsomely paid one, that the prognosis from that point forward isn't a Super Bowl. I think it's just to get frisky, get in the playoffs, and then maybe you'll have like a Nick Foles-like run from 2017. But for me, all hope of this team coming together, defense getting good, rested on Kirk Cousins staying healthy, and then he didn't. So I don't think they're going to win a Super Bowl. I didn't think that going into the Denver game, and I certainly don't think that now. My goal is for them to reach the postseason. Kevin O'Connell gets another playoff trip under his belt. You'll have times to evaluate Dobbs to see if he can be the patch-over guy to the next quarterback, or if you want to bring Cousins back. And thankfully, the next 3 games are really winnable. We haven't talked since Joe Burrow was injured, but after this, it's Monday Night Football against the Bears. They better win that. If they lose on Monday Night Football at home against the Bears, then you can panic. Then we'll have the show talking about how we're part of the overreaction. You can't lose at home to the Bears under the lights of primetime and want to be considered a playoff team. But after that, it's at the Raiders, who are a little bit better now, and then the Joe Burrow-less Bengals, which a game that when the schedule came out, I was like, oh, God. A road game at Joe Burrow's house, there's a loss. It doesn't feel like that anymore because Jake Browning is apparently going to start. We know all about him from the Vikings days. So all of the sins of this Broncos loss can be rinsed away a couple days after Thanksgiving. All you got to do is beat the Bears and everybody's back. Then you're at, 7-5, maybe 8-5 after the Raiders game. Like, everything is in the purview to reach the postseason. One thing I want to make sure we don't do, there is not going to be a quarterback controversy this week. There was a couple of folks nibbling at it on social media saying, will they go back to Jaren Hall? They're not going to kick Dobbs to the curb after a 1-point loss on the road to the suddenly hot Broncos. It's not going to happen. Now, if they lose to the Bears and Dobbs looks completely inept, you'd have the bye week. Then you might be able to think about Jaren Hall, but it would probably take 2 games after this for Dobbs to look utterly horrible for them to contemplate going to Nick Mullins or Jaren Hall. I think the marching orders here are beat the Bears on Monday Night Football and you'll be fine. I think that's the antidote right now. And consider this. In the last 40 years, the Vikings, when they have a turnover differential of 3 or more against them, they are 0-49 in road games. So there's just no way that this football team in my entire life, let alone my fandom, ever circumvents an upside-down turnover differential on the road. 0-49 when you're on the wrong side of the turnover differential by 3 or more in road games. So this is very much on brand. You turn the ball over 3 times, you don't force any of your own, you're going to lose. And that's exactly what happened. All right, we might have a patchwork schedule this week for recording the show because of the holiday, but we should be back sooner than later. Skol, baby.